Justice, the elite tool that defines so-called truth and extract. We're talking about justice, that so-called pillar of society, but not in the abstract philosophical sense. No, we're examining its precise role inside this layered hierarchy where elites at the top pull the strings through finance, information, and even belief systems to shape the masses, while the middle layers like governments, education, media, corporations, military, culture, and yes, organized crime, all feed into controlling the lower classes. And justice? It's embedded deep in that third level, functioning as the mechanism that decides what counts as the only valid truth, spots the so-called criminals, puts them straight to work, and uses punishment not to shield anyone but to deter resistance while quietly exploiting and draining the public at every turn. Picture this for a second. Most of us grow up thinking justice is about balance, about righting wrongs and keeping the peace. But once you start tracing the logic through the hierarchy, it becomes crystal clear that it's engineered for something far more calculated. The elites don't need to micromanage every courtroom themselves. They control the foundation at the first level with finance that can conjure currency from nothing, information flows that watch and steer narratives, and belief structures, whether religious or otherwise, that lock people into emotional compliance. That sets the stage. Then the second level kicks in, governments and all the rest directing the flow downward. And justice slots right there in the third tier, the sharp end of the spear that makes the whole thing operational. It doesn't just enforce rules. It manufactures the permitted version of reality itself. Before we dive deeper into this exploration, a quick reminder. If any part of this discussion stirs something in you, a sharp insight or powerful truth, like, comment, share the episode, and make sure you're following for more. Let's break that down logically because this isn't speculation. Start with how justice determines the only valid, permitted truth. In any system, truth isn't some floating absolute that everyone agrees on. Courts operate on evidence rules, procedures, precedents, and standards of proof that filter reality through a very narrow lens. What gets declared true in that arena isn't necessarily what actually happened in the raw sense. It's what the process allows to stand as fact. Why does that matter in the hierarchy? Because it lets those at the top define deviance on their terms. If a behavior threatens the flow of control, whether it's questioning the financial setup or challenging the information monopoly, the justice apparatus can label it criminal and make that label the only one that counts. Reason it out. If the goal was pure discovery of facts, there'd be no need for these procedural gates that favor the powerful who write the rules and fund the players. Instead, it produces a sanitized, official truth that keeps the middle and lower layers in check, turning potential disruptions into settled cases that reinforce the status quo. Now layer on the next piece. Identifying criminals and putting them to work. This is where the exploitation engine revs up. Once someone is tagged through that truth-defining process, the system doesn't just isolate them. It converts them into a renewable resource. Think about it. The hierarchy needs labor that doesn't demand wages, doesn't organize, and can't push back. Justice supplies exactly that by funneling people into positions where their output directly supports the structure above them. Prisons and related facilities become factories, service hubs, and maintenance crews, all running on coerced effort. The logic is airtight here. Elites at the top benefit indirectly through the corporations and governments they influence, which in turn save massive costs on public services and private operations. The middle class gets the illusion of security while the lower class supplies the bodies. If this was random or accidental, the numbers wouldn't line up so neatly with economic pressures from the financial level. But they do because the whole thing is designed to extract value upward. And punishment? Here's where the deterrent angle exposes the real game. The official line is that punishment protects the public by scaring off future acts or removing threats. But apply pure reason and that narrative collapses under its own weight. Deterrence works on the surface as a fear mechanism. Sure, but only enough to keep the compliant in line without actually solving underlying issues. If protection was the priority, the focus would shift to prevention at the education and culture levels, or real support structures that reduce the need for crime in the first place. Instead, punishment ramps up in ways that feed the labor pipeline. Refuse the work assignment? Face isolation, lost privileges, extended time, or worse. That isn't protection. That's conditioning obedience while the public gets robbed in two ways. First, through taxes and bureaucracy that fund the whole apparatus, and second, through the hidden profits from that unpaid labor flowing back into corporate and governmental hands. The public pays to maintain the machine that exploits its own members and then calls it justice. Logic dictates this isn't inefficiency. It's the intended design, draining life energy from the lower classes to keep the upper levels fat and stable. Weave this through the full hierarchy and the picture sharpens even more. Elites don't dirty their hands directly. They control the first-level levers so that finance dictates who gets investigated or let off, information shapes public perception of what counts as criminal, and belief systems prime people to accept the outcomes as moral or inevitable. Governments at the second level enforce it all with threats or implications, using justice as their everyday tool to manage the middle class downward. Education teaches rote acceptance of authority, media distracts from the mechanics, corporations reap the cheap labor benefits, the military stands ready if deterrence fails, culture polices the language and emotions around right and wrong, and crime itself gets tolerated or amplified just enough to justify more intervention while eliminating voices that blow the whistle. Justice sits embedded in that third tier like the linchpin. It turns abstract control into concrete action. Define the truth, tag the threats, extract the work, and punish to deter any organized pushback. The result? A self-perpetuating system where the masses stay poor, compliant, and productive for those above. Let's push the reasoning further on why punishment functions as a deterrent for exploitation rather than genuine public safeguarding. Suppose for a moment the system truly aimed at protection. Then recidivism wouldn't be baked in through environments that harden people instead of rebuilding them. Resources wouldn't flow into expanding the labor pools while community stability erodes. And selective enforcement wouldn't mirror economic and cultural pressures from higher up. But that's exactly what happens. The deterrent effect keeps the lower classes fearful and divided, preventing them from challenging the financial illusions or the information stranglehold. Meanwhile, the public as a whole gets robbed because every dollar poured into this justice machinery could have gone toward real stability, yet it instead circulates back as profit or control. Cold logic shows the protection story is a cover. The hierarchy demands a mechanism that identifies, isolates, and exploits without ever threatening the top. Justice delivers that perfectly, turning human lives into cogs that oil the machine. One more angle on the truth-defining power. In practice, the justice process doesn't chase objective reality. It constructs a version that serves the structure. Evidence gets weighed not by absolute certainty but by what fits the permitted narrative. Precedents lock in interpretations that favor property and order as defined by those with financial influence. This isn't accident. In a hierarchy built on control, the only valid truth must be the one that sustains the levels below the elites. Anything else gets reframed as criminal fantasy. Reason through it step by step. Without this filtering, the middle and lower classes might question why finance creates endless currency for the top while draining everyone else, or why information is increasingly watched and shaped. Justice closes that loop by making dissent or exposure legally untrue and punishable. The same logic applies to the work aspect. Once labeled, individuals lose autonomy over their labor entirely. Assignments come with no choice, minimal or zero compensation, and full exposure to hazards without protections. This isn't rehabilitation. It's a direct transfer of value from the convicted to the system that convicted them. Corporations tied to the second level get services or goods at rock-bottom cost. Governments offset their own operational burdens. The elites see their influence preserved because the lower classes remain economically subdued. If the intent was protection or even simple deterrence, voluntary programs with real incentives would dominate. But coercion proves the point. The hierarchy needs this labor pool to function efficiently while keeping the public narrative of fairness intact. Stepping back, the themes here all converge on one unbreakable chain. Justice doesn't float above the hierarchy. It's woven into it as the operational arm that translates elite control into everyday reality. It determines truth to legitimize the structure, identifies criminals to supply the workforce, and deploys punishment as a deterrent that masks the robbery of public resources and energy. Every level above it feeds into this, and every level below feels the squeeze. The brilliance, if you can call it that, lies in how seamlessly it operates. People accept the outcomes because the permitted truth says it's fair and necessary. But logic cuts through. Follow the incentives, trace the benefits, and the exploitation reveals itself. To drive this home, consider some of the clearest statements that have emerged from observing these systems over time. One historical reflection on punishment put it plainly. The real purpose isn't to reform or protect but to maintain the social order by turning the punished into tools of production. Another line of reasoning from classical thought on justice noted that true equity would never allow the powerful to define crime in ways that conveniently supply their labor needs. And in the context of post-major conflict reconstructions, observers noted how legal exceptions for forced work directly continued older exploitation patterns, proving the hierarchy adapts rather than abandons its core methods. These aren't isolated ideas. They echo the cold reality that punishment as deterrent serves control, not safety, and that the entire justice apparatus exists to keep the pyramid stable. So where does that leave us? If you've followed the logic this far, the next step is simple awareness. See justice not as an impartial force but as the embedded tool it truly is within the hierarchy. Question the permitted truths handed down, recognize how criminal labels feed the exploitation machine, and understand that deterrence keeps the public drained while the top stays insulated. The structure relies on us accepting the surface story. Break that by reasoning it through yourself. Share these connections with others who are ready to look deeper. The more we map it out clearly, the less power it holds in the shadows. Keep thinking critically and stay awake to the real mechanics at play. This is how we start dismantling the illusions. Stay free.